Everything you thought you knew about Napoleon Bonaparte might be wrong. For over 2 centuries, he has been painted as a ruthless dictator, a short-tempered warlord, and a power-hungry conqueror who left Europe in ruins. But how much of that is actually true? Was Napoleon really the villain history has made him out to be, or was he a misunderstood genius whose legacy was twisted by his enemies? Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most misunderstood figures in history. His name is associated with ambition, war, and domination, but what if much of what we believe about him is based on myths and propaganda rather than historical fact? For over 2 centuries, his reputation has been shaped not just by historians but by his greatest rivals, particularly the British, who spent years crafting a narrative that painted him as a dangerous tyrant. But as we dig deeper into his life, the truth begins to tell a different story. His rise to power was meteoric. Born on the small island of Corsica in 1769, Napoleon climbed the ranks of the French military with unmatched strategic brilliance. From an outsider mocked for his accent to the most powerful man in Europe, his journey was filled with battles, betrayals, and political maneuvering that transformed France and shook the world. His impact on modern society is undeniable. The Napoleonic Code still influences the legal systems of many countries today. His military strategies are studied in elite academies. Even in popular culture, his image has been immortalized in books, films, and art, often portraying him as either a hero or a villain, but rarely the complex figure he truly was. So, why has history painted such a distorted picture of him? Much of it has to do with the powerful nations that opposed him, especially Britain, which spent years demonizing him in newspapers, cartoons, and political speeches. Their goal was clear: to turn Napoleon into a cautionary tale, a symbol of unchecked power, and a convenient enemy to justify their wars against France. And the strategy worked. Many of the myths about Napoleon that we still believe today originated from that era, but it's time to separate fact from fiction. In this video, we will break down some of the biggest myths about Napoleon Bonaparte and reveal the shocking truths behind them. Was he really as short as they say? Was he obsessed with war, or did he fight out of necessity? Did he crown himself emperor out of arrogance, or was there a deeper reason behind it? And most importantly, what was the real cause of his mysterious death in exile? Stay with us as we uncover the hidden truths about one of history's most controversial figures. Prepare to be shocked, intrigued, and maybe even see Napoleon in a way you never have before. Myth 1. Napoleon was extremely short. The myth that refuses to die. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered as a tiny, angry man, compensating for his lack of height with a thirst for power and conquest. This belief is so widespread that it even inspired a psychological theory, the Napoleon complex, a term used to describe short men who overcompensate for their stature with aggression and dominance. But here's the shocking truth: Napoleon wasn't actually short at all. This persistent myth has shaped the way people view him for generations. Cartoons, films, and literature continue to depict him as a diminutive figure, barking orders and throwing tantrums, but the historical facts tell a completely different story. Napoleon was actually around 5 feet 6 inches, 1.69 meters, which was the average height for a Frenchman in the early 19th century. So, how did this myth gain traction, and why has it stuck around for over 200 years? The origins of the short Napoleon myth. The belief that Napoleon was incredibly short can be traced back to a few key factors: British propaganda, confusion over measurement systems, and his choice of bodyguards. British propaganda, the enemy's greatest weapon. One of the most effective ways to discredit a powerful leader is to turn him into a laughingstock. Napoleon's enemies, particularly the British, understood this well. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, British newspapers and political cartoons portrayed him as a tiny, weak, almost childlike figure desperately grasping for power. He was often drawn standing next to massive soldiers, towering generals, or even animals that appeared larger than him. British artists like James Gillray and George Cruikshank published satirical cartoons mocking Napoleon's supposed small stature, portraying him as a ridiculous, tantrum-throwing dictator. One of the most famous images, Little Boney, became a widely circulated depiction of Napoleon as a short, unimposing man trying to control a world far bigger than himself. The goal of this propaganda was simple: to make him seem less threatening. If Napoleon was seen as an almost comical character, it would be easier for the British public to rally against him and justify the war effort. This tactic worked so well that even after his fall, the idea of Napoleon as a tiny tyrant persisted, embedding itself into popular culture. Measurement confusion. The French versus British system. Another major reason behind the Napoleon height myth is a misinterpretation of French measurements. When Napoleon's height was recorded after his death in 1821, it was listed as 5 feet 2 inches. But here's the catch: this measurement was in French feet, not British feet. At the time, the French foot was slightly longer than the British foot, meaning that 5 feet 2 inches in French measurements actually translated to about 5 feet 6 inches in the British system. Unfortunately, many people failed to make this distinction, leading to widespread misinformation about his height. Historians and scholars have since corrected the record, but the damage had already been done. The idea that Napoleon was comically short had already taken hold in the public imagination, and once a myth gains momentum, it's hard to stop. The Imperial Guards, Napoleon's giant soldiers, another factor that contributed to the perception of Napoleon as short was his Imperial Guard. As emperor, Napoleon surrounded himself with his most elite soldiers, men chosen specifically for their impressive height and physical presence. The Imperial Guard soldiers were often over 6 feet tall, towering over the average French citizen. Napoleon's habit of standing among them made him appear smaller by comparison, even though he was actually average height for the time. This created an optical illusion in both paintings and battlefield accounts. Observers noted that Napoleon seemed shorter than he really was, and as the British propaganda machine continued to mock him, the myth of a tiny general leading enormous soldiers only grew stronger. How this myth affected Napoleon's legacy. The idea that Napoleon was unusually short may seem harmless, but it has had a lasting impact on how he is remembered. Over the years, his supposed height deficiency has been linked to psychological theories, pop culture portrayals, and even modern leadership stereotypes. The Napoleon complex and psychological theories. One of the most famous consequences of this myth is the creation of the Napoleon complex. This term is used to describe short men who overcompensate for their height with aggressive, domineering behavior. The concept has been used in psychology, business, and social discussions for years, often to explain why certain individuals exhibit controlling tendencies. The problem? The very foundation of the Napoleon complex is based on a myth. Napoleon did not suffer from any height insecurity, nor did he display signs of aggressive behavior due to his stature. In fact, many historical records describe him as calm, logical, and in control, rather than impulsive or overly aggressive. Studies in modern psychology have even debunked the Napoleon complex as a real phenomenon, showing that height does not necessarily correlate with aggression or dominance. Pop culture and the continued mockery of Napoleon. From cartoons to films, Napoleon continues to be portrayed as a short, frustrated man trying to prove himself. Whether it's comedic interpretations in movies, animated skits, or historical fiction, the myth remains deeply embedded in Western culture. In the classic novel, Animal Farm, by George Orwell, the power-hungry pig is named Napoleon, a direct reference to the perception of Napoleon Bonaparte as a tyrant with something to prove. The movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, portrays Napoleon as a short, egotistical character who constantly seeks validation. Even in modern references, calling someone a Napoleon implies short man syndrome, arrogance, and an overinflated sense of self-importance. The myth has outlived the man himself, shaping how Napoleon is viewed by the general public, despite the historical evidence proving it false. The reality of Napoleon's stature. So, what is the final verdict? Napoleon Bonaparte was not short. He was actually average height for his time, standing at 5 feet 6 inches, 1.69 meters, roughly the same height as famous figures like Winston Churchill and John Adams. The perception of him as tiny came from British propaganda, measurement confusion, and his preference for surrounding himself with tall guards. Despite modern historical corrections, the image of a tiny general still persists, showing the incredible power of misinformation in shaping history. Debunking the myth. Why it matters. Understanding the truth about Napoleon's height isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about recognizing how propaganda and misinformation can shape historical narratives. Napoleon's legacy, both positive and negative, should be examined based on facts, not myths. As we continue this journey of separating fact from fiction, the next myth we tackle is just as fascinating. Was Napoleon truly a warmonger, or was he actually a reluctant warrior forced into battle by his enemies? The answer might surprise you. Myth 2. Napoleon the warmonger, ruthless conqueror or reluctant warrior. Napoleon Bonaparte has long been labeled a bloodthirsty conqueror who plunged Europe into war for his own ambitions. His name is often mentioned alongside history's most aggressive rulers, painted as a man obsessed with conquest, expansion, and military dominance. But was Napoleon truly a warmonger, or was he a leader constantly forced into war by the enemies surrounding him? The image of Napoleon as a man who sought endless battles and cared little for peace is one of history's most persistent myths. While he undeniably led many wars, the idea that he was constantly seeking conflict for personal gain oversimplifies the reality of the Napoleonic Wars. The truth is that many of these wars were not started by Napoleon himself, but rather by the coalitions of European powers determined to stop him at any cost. The chaos Napoleon inherited, a nation at war. To understand Napoleon's military career, it is essential to look at the state of France before he rose to power. He did not inherit a peaceful nation. Instead, he took control of a country already embroiled in war and political chaos. The French Revolution had left the country in ruins. The monarchy had been overthrown, the aristocracy had been decimated, and the new French Republic faced hostility from nearly every major European power. By the time Napoleon emerged as a dominant figure, France had already been at war with Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other nations for nearly a decade. The monarchies of Europe saw revolutionary France as a threat to their own survival. They feared the spread of republican ideas. If the French people could overthrow their king, what would stop their own citizens from doing the same? This led to the War of the First Coalition, in which multiple European nations tried to crush France's new government. Napoleon entered the military during this chaotic period, proving himself a brilliant strategist. By the time he became first consul in 1799, France was still at war. Napoleon did not start these conflicts. He inherited them. In fact, one of his first priorities was to end the wars through diplomacy. A leader seeking peace. Napoleon's diplomatic effort. If Napoleon was truly obsessed with war, why did he spend so much time negotiating for peace? One of his first major diplomatic victories was the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, a peace agreement between France and Britain. For a brief period, Europe was at peace. Napoleon had successfully ended the conflict that had raged for years. However, this peace did not last. The British broke the Treaty of Amiens in 1803 by resuming war with France. Once again, Napoleon was forced back into conflict, not by choice but by necessity. Britain formed the Third Coalition, convincing Austria, Russia, and Sweden to join forces against Napoleon. He had little option but to respond. This pattern repeated itself throughout his reign. Every time Napoleon secured peace, a new coalition formed to bring him down. He fought not because he sought war but because the monarchies of Europe refused to accept a powerful and stable France under his rule. Defensive wars. Napoleon's real military record. The claim that Napoleon relentlessly sought war ignores the reality that many of his battles were defensive in nature. He was often reacting to threats rather than initiating them. Between 1803 and 1815, Britain alone organized 7 coalitions against France, each time gathering European powers to attack Napoleon. In contrast to the image of him as an aggressive conqueror, Napoleon often tried to avoid war. He made several peace proposals to the British government, all of which were rejected. His diplomatic letters to Tsar Alexander I of Russia show multiple attempts to prevent war with Russia before the disastrous 1812 invasion. If Napoleon had truly wanted endless conquest, he would have invaded Britain, but he never did. He spent years preparing for an invasion but ultimately abandoned it in favor of negotiating peace. His wars were primarily fought on European soil against nations that attacked France. The numbers don't lie. Was Napoleon more aggressive than other rulers? A closer look at the numbers reveals that Napoleon's military campaigns were not significantly more destructive than those of other European rulers. During his reign, Napoleon led France in 60 battles, winning most of them. However, when comparing casualty numbers, Napoleon's wars were not the bloodiest in European history. The 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, caused far more deaths, and even before Napoleon, France had engaged in frequent wars under Louis XIV. Historians estimate that between 3 to 6 million people died in the Napoleonic Wars. While this is a staggering number, it is comparable to the casualties of other European conflicts of the era. Britain and Russia also engaged in wars that led to millions of deaths, but their leaders were not labeled warmongers. Why the myth of Napoleon the warmonger persisted? If Napoleon was not an uncontrollable warmonger, why does history remember him that way? The answer lies in propaganda, particularly from Britain and Russia. British newspapers and political leaders demonized Napoleon as a dictator bent on world domination. They needed to justify spending massive amounts of money on war and mobilizing their citizens against France. The best way to do that was to portray Napoleon as an unstoppable force of destruction. Russia also contributed to this myth, especially after Napoleon's disastrous invasion in 1812. The Russian army in the brutal winter devastated Napoleon's forces, leading to one of his greatest defeats. Afterward, Tsar Alexander I portrayed the victory as a triumph over a ruthless conqueror, reinforcing the idea that Napoleon had brought war upon himself. The British victory at Waterloo in 1815 sealed this image. With Napoleon defeated and exiled, Britain had the final say in how he was remembered. Their version of history, Napoleon as a dangerous warlord, became the dominant narrative. The reality of Napoleon's military legacy. Napoleon was not a man obsessed with war. He was a brilliant military leader forced into battle by the political realities of his time. His strategic genius allowed him to dominate European battlefields, but he was not a bloodthirsty tyrant seeking destruction. He fought to defend France from foreign invasion, to stabilize the revolutionary government, and to resist the constant coalitions formed against him. His diplomatic efforts show that he wanted peace, but Europe refused to let him have it. Had the monarchies of Europe accepted a strong and independent France under Napoleon, the wars may have ended much sooner. But they saw him as a threat, not because of his military ambition, but because of what he represented, the end of the old aristocratic order and the rise of a new world based on meritocracy and reform. The myth of Napoleon the warmonger continues to this day, but history tells a different story. His greatest battles were often fought out of necessity, not desire. As we continue to separate fact from fiction, the next myth to explore is one of the most misunderstood moments of his rule, the day he placed the imperial crown upon his own head. Was this an act of arrogance, or was there a deeper reason behind it? Myth 3. Napoleon's coronation. Arrogance or a statement of power? One of the most famous moments in European history is Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation as Emperor of France. The event, which took place on December 2, 1804, in the grand setting of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, remains one of the most visually striking and controversial coronations of all time. For centuries, rulers of France had been crowned by the Pope, following a long tradition that symbolized divine authority bestowed upon kings by the Church. But Napoleon did something that shocked many. He took the crown from Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. This act has been interpreted as an unprecedented display of arrogance and defiance, a move that supposedly demonstrated Napoleon's belief that he was above all other rulers, even the authority of the Pope himself. The story of Napoleon crowning himself has become one of the most widely repeated myths about him, reinforcing the idea that he was a power-hungry dictator with an overinflated ego. But was this really an act of arrogance, or was there a deeper political message behind it? Why did Napoleon take the crown? To understand the significance of Napoleon's actions, it is essential to examine the historical and political context of the time. France had gone through a dramatic transformation following the French Revolution of 1789. The revolution had abolished the monarchy, executed King Louis XVI, and established a republic. The idea of divine rule, the belief that kings were appointed by God, was completely rejected by the revolutionaries. In its place, they established the idea that rulers derived their authority from the people, not from religious institutions. By 1804, Napoleon had risen to power as first consul and had already proven himself as France's most capable leader. He stabilized the country, ended years of internal chaos, and was widely recognized as the de facto ruler of France. But declaring himself emperor was not just a title change, it was a statement to both the French people and the rest of Europe. Had Napoleon allowed Pope Pius VII to crown him in the traditional manner, it would have symbolized submission to the authority of the Church, just as previous French monarchs had done for centuries. By placing the crown on his own head, Napoleon was making a clear declaration. His power did not come from the Pope, nor from God, it came from his own achievements and the will of the French people. This was not an act of arrogance, it was a carefully calculated move to send a powerful message. Napoleon and the Catholic Church, a complex relationship. While Napoleon's decision to crown himself was an assertion of independence, it did not mean that he was hostile toward the Catholic Church. In fact, just a few years earlier, he had made significant efforts to restore the Church's role in France after the chaos of the Revolution. During the revolutionary period, the Catholic Church had been severely weakened. Church lands were confiscated, religious institutions were abolished, and priests were forced to swear allegiance to the revolutionary government. This led to deep divisions in French society, with many citizens, especially in rural areas, feeling alienated by the state's hostility toward religion. Napoleon understood that religion played a crucial role in maintaining social stability, and he saw an opportunity to reconcile France with the Church. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, an agreement that restored religious freedom to Catholics and allowed the Church to operate in France once again. However, Napoleon made sure that the Church would remain under the control of the state, preventing the Pope from interfering in political matters. This demonstrates that Napoleon was not an enemy of the Church. He simply believed that religious authority should not dictate political power. His coronation was an extension of this philosophy. He was willing to work with the Pope, but he would not allow himself to be subordinate to him. The end of the divine right of kings. Napoleon's decision to crown himself represented a major shift in European power dynamics. For centuries, monarchs had justified their rule through the concept of the divine right of kings, which claimed that their authority was granted by God and reinforced through religious rituals. By breaking this tradition, Napoleon redefined the legitimacy of power. Instead of being anointed by religious authority, he was crowned as emperor based on his merit, military achievements, and the support of the people. This was a direct challenge to the ruling monarchs of Europe, many of whom still clung to the idea that their power was sacred and unquestionable. This shift was particularly significant because, at the time, most of Europe was still ruled by hereditary monarchies. Kings and emperors inherited their positions through bloodlines, regardless of their competence or leadership abilities. Napoleon, on the other hand, was not born into nobility. He was a self-made leader who had risen through the military ranks and had proven himself through skill and determination. His coronation sent a message that power should be earned, not inherited. It was a revolutionary idea that threatened the very foundations of the old aristocratic order. The famous painting, a carefully crafted image, one of the most iconic depictions of Napoleon's coronation is the painting by Jacques-Louis David, which captures the moment in stunning detail. Interestingly, while the painting does show Napoleon holding the crown, it does not actually depict him placing it on his own head. Instead, it focuses on the moment when Napoleon crowns Empress Josephine, a detail that is often overlooked in discussions of the event. This highlights another important aspect of Napoleon's coronation. He was not just legitimizing his own rule, he was also establishing a new dynasty. By crowning Josephine as Empress, he was making it clear that the Bonaparte family was now France's ruling house. Jacques-Louis David's painting was heavily influenced by Napoleon himself, who commissioned the artwork and carefully directed how it should be presented. This was another example of Napoleon's mastery of image and propaganda. He understood that his coronation was more than just an event, it was a spectacle designed to shape how future generations would remember him. The truth behind the myth. Napoleon did not crown himself out of arrogance. His decision was a political statement, not an act of defiance against the Pope or the Church. It was meant to symbolize that his rule was not dependent on divine authority but on his own achievements and the will of the people. Despite this, the myth of Napoleon as a power-hungry dictator who disrespected religious tradition has endured. Much like the British propaganda that mocked his height, this false narrative has been repeated so often that it has become accepted as fact. The reality is that Napoleon's coronation marked a turning point in European history. It represented the end of the old world order, where kings ruled by divine right, and the beginning of a new era, where leadership was based on merit, strategy, and ability. His rise to power was a direct challenge to the monarchies of Europe, and his actions reshaped the way rulers were viewed. No longer was royalty seen as an unquestionable force blessed by the heavens. Napoleon proved that power could be claimed, earned, and legitimized through the people. As we continue to separate fact from fiction, the next myth we will examine is another widely debated topic. Was Napoleon truly a tyrant who oppressed his people, or was he actually a reformer who brought progress to France? Myth 4. Napoleon, tyrant or reformer? The truth about his rule. Napoleon Bonaparte is often painted as a dictator who ruled France with an iron fist, a ruthless leader who placed power above all else. The common belief is that he crushed opposition, silenced dissent, and imposed authoritarian rule over the French people. This image has been reinforced over time, portraying Napoleon as a man who cared only for control and military conquest. But was Napoleon truly a tyrant, or was he one of the most progressive leaders France had ever seen? While his reign was undoubtedly authoritarian in nature, his policies tell a different story. Napoleon was not simply a power-hungry despot, he was a reformer who reshaped France in ways that are still felt today. From legal systems to religious tolerance, from economic stability to education reforms, Napoleon implemented sweeping changes that transformed France into a modern nation. Many of these reforms were not only radical at the time but laid the foundation for the society we know today. The truth is that Napoleon was more democratic than the kings who came before him, and in many ways, he offered his people more rights and freedoms than they had ever experienced under the monarchy. The Napoleonic Code, a legal revolution that changed the world. One of Napoleon's most significant contributions to history was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that still serves as the basis for laws in over 70 countries today. Before Napoleon, France's legal system was a chaotic mess, with different regions following different sets of laws. Justice was often arbitrary, favoring the wealthy and nobility while leaving the lower classes with little protection. The Napoleonic Code, introduced in 1804, revolutionized the legal system. It established a uniform set of laws based on principles of equality, individual rights, and secular governance. Among its many groundbreaking reforms, the Napoleonic Code abolished feudal privileges, ensuring that all citizens were equal before the law. Protected property rights, giving people legal security over their land and businesses. Granted legal rights to religious minorities, ensuring that one's faith would not impact their legal standing. Reformed family law, giving women some legal protections they previously lacked, though it still favored male authority. Established the presumption of innocence, a legal principle that continues to be a foundation of modern justice systems. Before Napoleon, France had been ruled by kings who placed the aristocracy above the common people. Under the monarchy, laws were inconsistent, and justice was often based on birthright rather than fairness. The Napoleonic Code changed that, introducing merit-based systems that rewarded talent rather than social class. Even today, many modern legal systems, including those in France, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and Latin American countries, still operate under principles established by Napoleon's reforms. Religious tolerance, ending centuries of religious persecution. Another area where Napoleon's leadership stands in contrast to the traditional image of a tyrant is religious freedom. France had a long history of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, with brutal persecution of religious minorities dating back centuries. The French Revolution had gone to the extreme of suppressing religion altogether, even going so far as to rename months and replace religious holidays with secular festivals. Napoleon, however, took a more pragmatic and inclusive approach. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, which restored Catholicism as the dominant religion in France while also allowing freedom of worship for other faiths. This was a radical departure from previous rulers who had either enforced Catholic supremacy or attempted to erase religion entirely. But Napoleon did not allow the Church to regain political power. His Concordat ensured that the state, not the Pope, controlled religious affairs in France. This delicate balance allowed for religious stability while preventing the return of a theocratic monarchy. Furthermore, Napoleon extended religious protections to Jews and Protestants, giving them the same rights as Catholic citizens. This was particularly significant because Jewish communities in Europe had been persecuted for centuries, often forced to live in ghettos with restricted rights. Under Napoleon, Jews were granted full citizenship and allowed to own property, serve in the military, and participate in government. Economic stability, ending inflation and modernizing France. Napoleon did not just transform France's legal and religious systems, he also rescued its economy. After the financial collapse of the revolutionary era, the French economy was in shambles. Inflation was high, and trust in the financial system had eroded. One of Napoleon's greatest achievements was the creation of the Banque de France in 1800, which helped stabilize the currency and strengthen the economy. He introduced a system of state-backed financial institutions, ensuring that France had a stable, centralized banking system for the first time in its history. He also reformed taxation, ensuring that everyone, rich and poor, paid taxes fairly. Unlike previous monarchs who placed most of the tax burden on the lower classes while allowing the aristocracy to live tax-free, Napoleon implemented a system that spread taxation more evenly. By doing so, he revitalized trade, boosted industrial production, and modernized infrastructure, ensuring that France could compete economically with the other great powers of Europe. Merit-based promotions, a leader who rewarded talent. One of Napoleon's most revolutionary policies was his commitment to meritocracy. Unlike the hereditary aristocracies that dominated Europe, Napoleon believed that leadership should be based on ability, not birthright. He famously declared, "Careers open to talent," meaning that individuals would be promoted based on skill and achievement rather than social class. Under Napoleon, soldiers, administrators, and government officials were given opportunities based on competence rather than noble bloodlines. This was a radical break from the past, when positions of power were reserved for the wealthy elite. This policy extended beyond the military. Napoleon's education reforms ensured that talented individuals, regardless of background, could rise through the ranks of government and academia. He established lycées, state-run secondary schools, to educate future leaders, providing France with a highly trained and competent civil service. Was Napoleon more democratic than the kings before him? While Napoleon did concentrate power in his own hands, his reforms undeniably offered more rights and opportunities to the French people than the monarchy ever had. Before Napoleon, France was ruled by kings who inherited their power, suppressed dissent, and preserved privileges for the aristocracy. Napoleon, on the other hand, rewarded talent, promoted legal equality, and modernized the state. His government was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it was more open, dynamic, and progressive than the regimes that had ruled France before him. He consulted the people through referendums, and his policies were largely supported by the population, evidenced by the fact that he remained popular even after his exile. The lasting impact of Napoleon's reform. Napoleon's rule was not without flaws, and he certainly engaged in authoritarian practices to maintain control. However, the idea that he was simply a tyrant who oppressed his people ignores the reality that he was one of the most effective reformers in French history. His policies reshaped France, bringing stability, legal structure, economic prosperity, and equal opportunity to a country that had been torn apart by revolution. Many of the systems he introduced, from the Napoleonic Code to the Banque de France, continue to influence the world today. As we continue to separate fact from fiction, the next myth we explore is one of the most debated moments of Napoleon's military career. Was his downfall due to incompetence, or were there other forces at play? The answer might surprise you. Myth 5. Napoleon's defeat, arrogance or uncontrollable circumstances. One of the most persistent myths surrounding Napoleon Bonaparte is the idea that he was solely responsible for his own downfall. The popular belief paints him as an arrogant, overconfident ruler who made reckless decisions that led to his ultimate defeat. Many claim that his failure in Russia was due to his refusal to listen to advisors, that his military strategies became outdated, and that he underestimated his enemies. But was Napoleon truly brought down by his own incompetence, or were there larger forces at play that even a brilliant strategist like him could not control? While Napoleon certainly made mistakes, his downfall was not simply a result of arrogance. In reality, several key factors led to his defeat, many of which were beyond his control. These included extreme weather conditions, devastating supply chain failures, betrayals from allies, and the relentless opposition of Britain and Prussia. The truth is that Napoleon remained one of the most formidable military minds in history, but no leader, no matter how skilled, could have survived the perfect storm that ultimately led to his fall. The Russian campaign, a disaster of unimaginable proportions. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 is often cited as one of the greatest military blunders in history. The image of his once mighty Grand Army reduced to a starving, freezing mass of soldiers retreating through the snow is one of the most iconic scenes of his downfall. But the reality of what happened in Russia is far more complex than the simple idea that Napoleon made a foolish mistake. When Napoleon launched his campaign against Russia, he did so with an army of over 600,000 soldiers, the largest force he had ever assembled. His goal was to bring Tsar Alexander I to the negotiation table and force Russia to honor their alliance with France. However, the Russians had no intention of fighting a direct war with Napoleon. Instead, they employed scorched earth tactics, retreating deeper into the country while burning towns, food supplies, and resources behind them. As the French army advanced, they found themselves moving through a barren wasteland. They were unable to secure food, fresh water, or shelter. With each passing day, Napoleon's forces grew weaker, not due to battles, but due to starvation, exhaustion, and disease. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he expected to take control of the city and force the Tsar into surrender. Instead, he found Moscow abandoned and in flames. The Russians had set fire to their own capital rather than allow Napoleon to use it as a strategic base. With no supplies and no way to hold the city, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. Then came the winter. The brutal Russian winter of 1812 was one of the harshest in recorded history. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees Celsius, 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and French soldiers, already weak and starving, began to freeze to death. Horses collapsed from the cold, leaving artillery and wagons abandoned. The French army was now in complete chaos, harassed by Russian forces at every turn. By the time Napoleon's shattered army staggered out of Russia, only 100,000 soldiers remained. The rest had perished due to exposure, hunger, or battle. It was one of the most catastrophic losses in military history, but was it really due to Napoleon's incompetence? In truth, no European general had ever successfully invaded Russia and survived. The same tactics that defeated Napoleon had also been used against Charles XII of Sweden in 1709 and would later be used against Hitler's forces in World War II. The Russian landscape and climate made it almost impossible for an invading army to succeed. Napoleon was not the first, nor the last, to fall into this trap. The role of Britain and Prussia in Napoleon's final defeat. Napoleon's downfall was not just about Russia. Even after the disastrous retreat from Moscow, he still retained power in France, and his enemies knew they needed to act quickly before he could rebuild his forces. Britain, which had been Napoleon's most persistent enemy, saw an opportunity to strike. They immediately funded and organized the Sixth Coalition, bringing together Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden to wage war against Napoleon. One of the most decisive moments came at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, also known as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle in European history before World War I, involving over 600,000 soldiers. Napoleon found himself outnumbered nearly 2-1, and despite his strategic genius, he could not overcome the sheer size of the opposing forces. The battle ended in a devastating defeat, forcing Napoleon to retreat back to France. In 1814, the coalition forces invaded France itself, and for the first time, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and go into exile on the island of Elba. Even then, Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, he made a daring return to France, escaping from Elba and rallying his former soldiers in what became known as the 100 Days. With lightning speed, he regained control of the French government and marched once again to war. His final battle came at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. Facing the combined armies of Britain and Prussia, Napoleon fought one of the hardest battles of his career. At several points, it seemed as though he might actually win, but British commander Duke of Wellington held his position until Prussian reinforcements arrived, sealing Napoleon's fate. After Waterloo, Napoleon was captured and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his life. Was Napoleon one of the greatest generals in history? Despite his final defeat, Napoleon remains one of the most brilliant military strategists the world has ever seen. His campaigns revolutionized modern warfare, and his tactics are still studied in military academies today. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to outmaneuver larger armies by using speed, deception, and precise battlefield tactics. His victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Ulm demonstrated his ability to divide and conquer enemy forces, winning battles against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 is often considered his masterpiece. Facing a combined army of Russians and Austrians, Napoleon tricked them into thinking he was weak, luring them into a vulnerable position. Then, in a perfectly timed attack, he struck their center, encircled their forces, and completely destroyed the enemy army. It was one of the most decisive victories in military history. His ability to control massive armies, reorganize the battlefield in real time, and predict his enemy's movements set him apart from any other general of his era. Even the British, the truth about Napoleon's defeat. Napoleon was not defeated because he was incompetent. His downfall was the result of uncontrollable circumstances, a brutal Russian winter, a supply chain disaster, betrayals from former allies, and the sheer military force of Britain, Prussia, and Russia working together to bring him down. No single general could have overcome these challenges. Even after losing everything, Napoleon remained a legend. His influence on military strategy, governance, and leadership remains unmatched. The myth of Napoleon as a reckless and arrogant leader who lost because of his own mistakes is a distortion of history. While he certainly had his flaws, his record speaks for itself. His legacy as one of history's greatest military minds is undeniable, and the lessons from his rise and fall continue to shape our understanding of power, war, and leadership. As we continue separating fact from fiction, the next myth we will uncover is one of the most debated mysteries surrounding Napoleon's final days. Was he poisoned in exile, or did he die of natural causes? The answer may surprise you. Myth 6. Napoleon's death, poisoned or natural causes? Few historical figures have inspired as much speculation and controversy as Napoleon Bonaparte, and even in death, the mysteries surrounding him persist. The most enduring myth claims that Napoleon was poisoned by the British while in exile on the remote island of St. Helena. According to this theory, Britain saw Napoleon as too dangerous to be left alive, even after his final defeat at Waterloo, and orchestrated a slow assassination using arsenic poisoning. The idea of Napoleon being poisoned is not new. It has circulated for nearly 2 centuries, fueled by reports that high levels of arsenic were found in samples of his hair. Some have suggested that he was killed to prevent him from escaping exile and returning to power, while others argue that political enemies, either British agents or disloyal French royalists, had reasons to silence him permanently. But how much truth is there to this claim? Was Napoleon truly the victim of an assassination, or did he die from natural causes, as official records suggest? The official cause of death, stomach cancer or something more? When Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, the official autopsy conducted by French and British doctors concluded that the cause of death was stomach cancer. His personal physician, Dr. Francesco Antomacchi, recorded that his stomach was severely ulcerated and showed clear signs of disease. This diagnosis was not entirely surprising. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, had also died of stomach cancer, which suggested a possible genetic predisposition. Reports from his time in exile indicate that Napoleon had severe abdominal pain, weight loss, and frequent nausea in the months leading up to his death, common symptoms of stomach cancer. However, the autopsy results did little to stop the speculation. Many of Napoleon's supporters refused to believe that he had simply died of natural causes. They pointed to the mysterious circumstances of his exile, the restrictive conditions imposed by the British, and the fact that his health had deteriorated rapidly. Over the years, the poison theory gained traction, leading to modern scientific investigations that challenged the original diagnosis. The arsenic poisoning theory, fact or fiction? The theory that Napoleon was poisoned gained significant attention in the 1960s, when scientists examined strands of his hair and found abnormally high levels of arsenic, a substance commonly used in poisons during the 19th century. These findings ignited a firestorm of speculation. Supporters of the poisoning theory argue that Napoleon's British captors may have administered small, repeated doses of arsenic over time, leading to a slow and undetectable death. Arsenic poisoning, when administered gradually, can mimic symptoms of stomach cancer, making it a perfect method for assassination. However, the arsenic theory has its flaws. Further research into Napoleon's hair samples from different periods of his life showed that he had high levels of arsenic long before his exile. This suggests that he may have been exposed to arsenic through his environment, diet, or medical treatments. During Napoleon's time, arsenic was present in many household items, including wallpaper, cosmetics, medicines, and even food preservatives. The island of St. Helena, where Napoleon was exiled, had a damp climate that may have caused the green wallpaper in his home to release arsenic fumes. Given that arsenic was commonly used in the 19th century, finding traces of it in Napoleon's hair does not necessarily mean he was poisoned intentionally. Medical experts have also pointed out that Napoleon did not show the typical symptoms of arsenic poisoning, such as skin discoloration, extreme vomiting, or neurological damage. His symptoms, chronic stomach pain, digestive issues, and weakness, align more closely with advanced stomach cancer. Who would have benefited from Napoleon's death? If Napoleon had been poisoned, the question remains, who would have benefited the most from his death? While the British are often blamed, they actually had little reason to kill him in exile. After his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, an island over 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass in the South Atlantic Ocean. Unlike his first exile on Elba, where he had famously escaped, his second exile was far more secure. He was constantly monitored, and any attempt to return to Europe would have been nearly impossible. With Napoleon already removed from power, Britain had little incentive to risk a scandal by assassinating him. Instead, they ensured that he was isolated, heavily guarded, and deprived of any means of communication with the outside world. If anything, the British would have preferred that he live out his days in obscurity rather than turn him into a martyr. Some historians argue that French royalists had more to gain from Napoleon's death than the British. After his fall, the Bourbon monarchy was restored to power in France, but as long as Napoleon was alive, there was always a fear that he could return and reclaim the throne. His death removed the possibility of another Napoleonic resurgence and secured the Bourbon dynasty's rule. The psychological toll of exile. Regardless of whether Napoleon died of stomach cancer or foul play, one thing is certain: his years on St. Helena took a severe toll on his physical and mental health. The once powerful emperor who had dominated Europe was now a prisoner on a remote island, with no allies, no army, and no control over his destiny. His captors imposed strict rules to prevent him from escaping or communicating with his supporters. He was denied access to newspapers, letters, and visitors from France. He spent his days in isolation, dictating his memoirs, walking in his garden, and reflecting on the empire he had lost. Accounts from those who remained with him in exile describe how his health rapidly deteriorated. He suffered from chronic pain, weakness, depression, and growing paranoia. Some believe that his mental state played a role in his declining health, making him more susceptible to illness. By early 1821, Napoleon's condition worsened, and on May 5, 1821, he passed away. His last words reportedly were, "France, army, head of the army, Josephine," a final tribute to his lost empire and the woman he had once loved. The final verdict: poison or disease. Modern medical analyses have largely discredited the arsenic poisoning theory. While arsenic was found in his hair, its levels were consistent with normal exposure from the environment. His symptoms, combined with the autopsy report, strongly suggest that he died from stomach cancer, possibly worsened by the stress of exile. Despite this, the myth of Napoleon being poisoned has persisted, largely because it fits the narrative of a tragic hero, betrayed and silenced by his enemies. Whether by natural causes or something more sinister, Napoleon's death marked the end of an era. His life had reshaped Europe, and even in his final moments, he remained a figure of endless fascination and debate. His legacy, however, would continue to grow. The myths surrounding him, his height, his military campaigns, his downfall, and his death, became part of the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte. Even in death, he was larger than life. As we continue to separate truth from fiction, the next myth we uncover will explore Napoleon's enduring influence on the modern world. Was he truly a power-hungry ruler who sought only conquest, or was his impact far greater than we realize? Napoleon's legacy. The truth behind the myth. Napoleon Bonaparte's influence on the world is undeniable. More than 2 centuries after his death, his name continues to spark debates, admiration, and controversy. Was he a brilliant reformer who modernized Europe, or was he simply a military dictator who plunged the continent into war? Did he build a lasting legacy of law and governance, or was his impact overshadowed by the destruction he caused? History has remembered Napoleon in many ways, depending on which side of the battlefield one stood. In France, Italy, and Egypt, he is often seen as a visionary leader who reshaped society, law, and military tactics. But in Britain and Russia, he is frequently portrayed as a villainous warmonger who sought global domination. The truth is more complex than either extreme. Napoleon's legacy was shaped as much by his policies and reforms as it was by propaganda and historical revisionism. Understanding the real impact of his rule means looking beyond the myths and examining how he truly changed the world. The Napoleonic Code, the legal system that shaped nations. One of Napoleon's most significant contributions to history was the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework introduced in 1804 that remains one of the most influential legal systems in the world today. Before Napoleon, France's legal system was fragmented, with different regions following conflicting laws based on medieval customs. Justice was often biased in favor of the nobility, and the legal rights of ordinary citizens were unclear. The Napoleonic Code changed everything. It established a clear, standardized legal system that ensured equality before the law, protection of private property, and the abolition of feudal privileges. Unlike the old aristocratic order, where birthright determined legal standing, Napoleon's reforms emphasized meritocracy and fairness. The influence of the Napoleonic Code extended far beyond France. Countries across Europe, Latin America, and even parts of Asia adopted legal systems based on Napoleon's reforms. Today, modern legal systems in countries such as Belgium, Italy, Spain, and Turkey still operate under principles laid out in the Napoleonic Code. His reforms also influenced criminal justice, business regulations, and civil rights. Even the presumption of innocence, one of the cornerstones of modern law, was codified in Napoleon's legal system. These changes, radical at the time, became permanent fixtures in modern governance. A military genius who redefined warfare, and Napoleon's military campaigns revolutionized the way wars were fought. His strategies, tactics, and battlefield innovations are still studied in military academies today. One of his greatest contributions was the use of mobility and speed in warfare. Before Napoleon, European armies moved slowly, engaging in static, drawn-out battles with rigid formations. Napoleon changed this by introducing rapid troop movements, flexible formations, and surprise attacks. He understood the power of deception, speed, and logistics, allowing him to defeat numerically superior enemies through strategy rather than sheer force. His divisional system allowed him to split his army into self-sufficient units, enabling faster movement and better coordination. This innovation would later influence modern military doctrines, including blitzkrieg tactics used by Germany in World War II. Napoleon was also a master of psychological warfare. He understood that victory wasn't just about numbers or weapons, it was about breaking the enemy's will to fight. His speeches, battlefield maneuvers, and carefully crafted image turned him into a legendary figure, inspiring soldiers to fight beyond their limits. Even after his death, Napoleon's influence on military strategy remained unmatched. Generals from Robert E. Lee in the American Civil War to Erwin Rommel in World War II studied his tactics, adapting his principles to their own battles. His ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies cemented his status as one of history's greatest generals. The role of propaganda in Napoleon's legacy. Much of what we believe about Napoleon today has been shaped not by facts, but by propaganda, especially from Britain and Russia. Britain, which fought Napoleon for nearly 2 decades, led one of the most effective smear campaigns in history. Through political cartoons, newspapers, and public speeches, they painted him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a warmonger, and even a tiny, comical figure obsessed with power. One of the most famous examples was the "Little Boney" caricature, which mocked Napoleon's height and portrayed him as a man suffering from an inferiority complex. British newspapers frequently referred to him as a Corsican monster, a dictator who enslaved Europe, and a man who sought world domination. Russia also had reasons to demonize Napoleon. After his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, the Russian government portrayed him as a reckless invader who brought destruction upon himself. They emphasized his defeat by the Russian winter, downplaying the scorched earth tactics and relentless guerrilla warfare that had crippled his army. These narratives were so effective that even after Napoleon's death, they continued to shape how history viewed him. The British, in particular, controlled much of the historical record surrounding Napoleon's downfall, ensuring that their version of events became the accepted truth. How should history remember Napoleon? Napoleon remains one of history's most polarizing figures. In France, Italy, and Egypt, he is often celebrated as a hero, a reformer, and a leader who brought progress. But in Britain and Russia, he is remembered as a villain, an invader, and a man who left a trail of destruction. In France, Napoleon is still admired for his legal reforms, military brilliance, and contributions to modern governance. His tomb in Les Invalides, Paris, remains one of the most visited historical sites in the country. Many French citizens still see him as a symbol of national pride and strength. In Italy, Napoleon is remembered for helping unify regions that had long been divided. He introduced modern governance, improved infrastructure, and helped shape the early foundations of Italian nationalism. In Egypt, Napoleon's invasion may have been a military failure, but it introduced scientific and historical discoveries that transformed the world's understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon's expedition, was the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs. In Britain, however, he remains the ultimate enemy, the man who threatened their empire and dominated Europe for nearly 15 years. British historical narratives continue to focus on Waterloo, his exile, and his portrayal as a dictator. In Russia, Napoleon is remembered as the invader who underestimated the strength of the Russian people. His defeat in 1812 is celebrated as a triumph of Russian resilience, despite the massive losses suffered on both sides. Historical revisionism, changing views on Napoleon. As historians have revisited Napoleon's legacy, many of the old myths have been challenged. Modern research has discredited the idea that he was short, that he was obsessed with war, and that he was poisoned in exile. More scholars now recognize that his legal and military reforms shaped the modern world far more than his conquests. In recent years, debates have emerged about whether Napoleon should be seen as a hero or a dictator. Some argue that he represents the transition from monarchy to modern governance, while others focus on the wars and destruction he left behind. Regardless of perspective, one fact remains clear: Napoleon Bonaparte changed history. His impact on law, military strategy, governance, and even national identity is still felt today. He was neither a perfect hero nor a ruthless villain. He was a complex leader who reshaped Europe and left a legacy that still sparks debate centuries later. As we separate fact from fiction, one thing is certain: the real Napoleon was far greater than the myths that surround him. The truth behind Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most controversial figures in history, a man whose life has been wrapped in myths, propaganda, and historical distortions. From the idea that he was a short, power-hungry tyrant to the claim that he was obsessed with war and ultimately doomed by his own incompetence, the narratives surrounding him have often overshadowed the reality. But as we have uncovered, many of these widely accepted stories are either exaggerated, misleading, or entirely false. Napoleon was not abnormally short. He was actually average height for his time. He was not a reckless warmonger. He inherited wars that he often tried to end through diplomacy. He did not crown himself out of arrogance. He did so to symbolize that his power came from his own achievements, not the Pope. He was not simply a dictator who crushed his people. He introduced some of the most progressive legal, economic, and social reforms in modern history. His defeat was not due to arrogance or incompetence, but rather to a combination of extreme conditions, betrayals, and the overwhelming force of his enemies. Even his death remains a subject of debate, though modern evidence suggests that stomach cancer, not poisoning, was the real cause. Why it's important to challenge historical narrative. History is often written by the victors, and Napoleon's story is a perfect example of how propaganda, national interests, and political biases shape how we remember the past. The British and Russian governments, both of whom viewed Napoleon as their greatest enemy, spent years crafting an image of him as a dangerous despot. These narratives were designed to justify their wars against him, to maintain public support for military campaigns, and to ensure that no future leader could rise with the same level of power and influence. But as we have seen, the truth is rarely black and white. Napoleon was not a flawless hero, nor was he the villain history has often portrayed him to be. His legacy is complex, multi-dimensional, and filled with contradictions. He was a brilliant military strategist but also a ruthless leader when necessary. He brought stability and progress to France but also engaged in wars that reshaped Europe. His impact is still felt today in legal systems, military doctrines, and governance models across the world. Join the discussion. What do you think about Napoleon? Now that we've separated fact from fiction, it's time to hear your thoughts. Was Napoleon one of history's greatest leaders, or was he just another conqueror who left destruction in his wake? Did he change the world for the better, or was his ambition ultimately his greatest flaw? Leave a comment below and let's continue the discussion. Napoleon's story is far from over, and history is always evolving as new evidence comes to light. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Napoleon Bonaparte, myths versus facts, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video to help uncover the truth behind history's most famous figures. Thank you for watching, and until next time.